In the autumn of 1638, the woods on the east bank of the Musketaquid River resounded with the crack of hatchets on tree trunks and the thunk of spades in soil. It was absolutely imperative that the settlers build their first shelters before the cold set in. The immigrants of the Confidence were staring down the barrel of their first Massachusetts winter. Doubtless some settlers from Watertown, like William Pelham, who had been in the New World 8 years, impressed upon new arrivals like Edmund Goodnow how much harsher and longer the cold months were here than in England. It must have been a tense and uncomfortable few weeks for the Goodnows, as Edmund worked tirelessly to build an embankment house. His wife Anne engaged in the equally exhausting task of placating their 2 small children. Unfortunately, the snows probably brought no respite. The great challenge that first winter was likely keeping the cows and pigs alive, upon which the colonists' livelihoods depended. Though Musketaquid was resplendent with natural clearings, the long grasses which gave the valley its name died in winter, leaving the cows with precious little good grazing. The pigs, hardier and less discriminating, probably fared better, but packs of wild wolves remained a constant threat to the safety of both species. We know from town records that a local ordinance was passed sometime before 1646, offering a 10-shilling bounty for any wolf killed within town limits, which indicates the severity of the problem. In spring, the work of building the infrastructure of the new town could begin in earnest. It was a community effort, and every able-bodied male settler was expected to pitch in. A committee of town commissioners was formed to oversee these operations and enforce compliance. Among them was Peter Noyes, Brian Pendleton, Walter Haynes, George Munnings, and Edmund Brown. One of their first ordinances, passed in February 1639, threatened a 5-shilling fine to anyone who failed to assist in laying out the first town roads, which mainly consisted of widening out and flattening old Native American trails. The first road, corresponding closely to modern Route 27, was established just below the East Bank Ridge, where most of the first dwellings were concentrated. Overlooking an enormous meadow, farmers promptly began utilizing as a cow common. Just a quarter-mile upriver, the settlers laid out another road leading to an eminence they called Brindle Point, where the Noyes family had their cabin. From there it turned south, reaching its terminus in a thickly wooded glen christened Timber Neck, where Edmund Brown built his isolated homestead alongside the bubbling waters of Pine Brook. Downriver, a third cart path snaked north, then south, and eventually east, picking up the trail leading back to Watertown. Here, Walter Haynes and Brian Pendleton made their homes. Another early construction was the first grist mill, erected by one Thomas Cakebread in the spring of 1639 at the southern end of a modest body of water known ever since as Mill Pond. Cakebread died shortly after completing his mill, after which it was administered by his son-in-law John Grout. Cakebread's body may have been one of the first interred at the newly established town cemetery, at the highest point of the East Bank Ridge, just steps away from the Goodnow cabin. Though at least a few settlers perished that first precarious winter, the little community quickly began growing in size as newcomers continued to arrive throughout 1639 and 1640, seeking land and opportunity. With the summer heat came the happy realization that the seeds planted that spring were growing into a strong and healthy crop. It was time for the commissioners to return to Boston to petition for formal incorporation as a town. On September 4th, 1639, almost a year after the Watertown exodus, the General Court made the following pronouncement.
It is ordered that the no plantation boy conquered shall be called Sudbury. The order of the court upon the petition of the inhabitants of Sudbury is that Peter Noyes, Brian Pendleton, John Parmenter, Edmund Brown, Walter Rains, George Munnings, and Edmund Royce have commission to lay out lands to the present inhabitants, according to their estates and persons.
Noyes was appointed Surveyor of Arms and given the responsibility to make a record of all firearms and ammunition in Sudbury, and to enforce gun laws, especially those regarding the sale of muskets, powder, or shot to Native Americans. He was also authorized, if need be, to confiscate firearms for public purposes. Pendleton was named first captain of the Sudbury militia, and Edmund Goodnow was given the post of town marshal, charged with keeping the peace. The division of farmland in Sudbury was radically equitable by the standards of the time, and every white male inhabitant had the opportunity for land ownership. The town commissioners briefly toyed with the idea of automatically providing 6 acres to every married man, plus additional acreage per member of his family and herd. Eventually, they settled upon the more conservative policy of correlating the size of land grants to residents' net worth. The wealthiest townsmen received the largest acreage of meadowland, second wealthiest the second largest, etc. But even the most meager landowners in Sudbury enjoyed an immediate increase in social status, simply by virtue of that ownership. For a man like Edmund Goodnow, once a feudal tenant in England, now an important local official and one of the biggest landowners in town, that rise must have felt meteoric. Over the next few years, life in Sudbury settled into a comfortable equilibrium. More settlers arrived, more houses went up, the rough pioneers' cabins were pulled down and replaced by larger and more permanent abodes. In 1643, the first town bridge was built across the Sudbury River, and settlers began colonizing the west bank along Water Row Road. The road is still there today, and a bridge has stood at that same river crossing for 400 years. Also in 1643, Sudbury reached a crucial milestone in its development with the erection of the first meeting house, a modest one-room structure built adjacent to the cemetery. A carpenter named John Rutter supervised its construction, and by order of the town commissioners, every family with a house lot was required to send at least one man to aid him in the task. The meeting house was the center of town life in Puritan Sudbury. Edmund Goodnow's son, John, now about 10 years old, was given the task of beating the drum that would call the townspeople to meeting. When the drum beat, attendance was mandatory, no matter the event, and even when travel across the town was hazardous due to spring floods or winter ice. On Sundays, of course, Reverend Brown would lead the town in prayer. Services started in mid-morning and lasted about 2 or 3 hours with a break at noon. The meeting house was unheated and grew bitterly cold in the winter. So as soon as Brown announced intermission, the half-frozen congregants lurched out to the noon house, a stable-like building nearby which would have had a crude fireplace. Here, the congregants would warm up, get their blood flowing again, and nibble on a packed lunch. Townspeople were also expected to attend a weekly lecture day at the meeting house, which probably occurred on Thursday or Friday. Though ostensibly a secular event, the lecture in question was usually a religious one, and was probably also delivered by Reverend Brown. But Lecture Day was also an opportunity to share town news, to resolve legal disputes, to collect bounties, such as those for dead wolves, or to receive criminal punishment. Though this was probably a rarity in early Sudbury, as during the first decade of the town's history, crime was virtually non-existent. And once a month, young John Goodnow would beat the drum for town meetings, which have been periodically held in Wayland and Sudbury ever since. In 17th century New England, town meetings were an open political assembly where all major policies affecting the town and its people were communally decided. Though only land-owning church members were eligible to vote in town elections, every white male inhabitant could propose legislation or make a petition. Sudbury has never had a mayor, nor has it ever been led by a single person. The highest-ranking municipal officials were and are the annually elected Board of Selectmen. The small scale of Sudbury as a society and general lack of interference from the central colonial government in Boston certainly helped maintain its efficiency as a self-governing legislative body. Politics in Puritan Sudbury were highly flexible, and elections amounted to nothing more formal than a show of hands. When problems in town came up, the man most suited to solving them would be temporarily appointed to a town post, possibly highway surveyor, or fence viewer, invoice taker, or swine keeper, and given leave to perform that role. A reflection of Puritans' commitment to localized self-government and equality under the law, town meetings are the closest a legally sanctioned Anglo-American political system has ever gotten to true, direct democracy. Colonists enjoyed much more personal liberty and social mobility here than in England. Their society was libertarian in the broadest sense, but far more focused on the community than the individual, and personal freedom had hard limits as dictated by religious and moral dogma. The townspeople of Sudbury did not shed every trace of the hierarchy of the old world, but Puritan ideology, coupled with the experimentation and necessity of frontier life, generated a political culture of democratic self-sufficiency, which 130 years later would inspire their great-great-grandchildren to assemble on Sudbury's training fields and march north to face the British Army at Concord. During the first 40 years of Sudbury's existence, the Book of Town Records did not once mention the King, the Privy Council, the English Church, Parliament, or English Justices of the Peace. The townspeople built their own infrastructure, passed their own laws, taxed themselves, and distributed their own public money as they saw fit. The General Court in Boston was the only authority the town deferred to, and even then, the court steadily granted town government more power over its own civil affairs throughout the 1640s, as Sudbury grew out of its vulnerable infancy. Back in England at this time, the revolutionary fervour of Puritanism was reaching its apex with the outbreak of the English Civil Wars. When news of the execution of King Charles I reached New England in the spring of 1649, the people of Sudbury would no doubt have celebrated. The occasion must have been especially meaningful for Sudbury resident Thomas Axtell, whose brother Daniel commanded the Parliamentary Guard at the King's trial for treason. Further news of Oliver Cromwell's victory over Royalist Scottish forces at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650 was marked by a day of thanksgiving throughout Massachusetts Bay. In a letter to friends in England, Henry Dunster, the president of Harvard College and a Sudbury landowner, explained that while colonists disagreed on many fine theological and political points, they were united in their commitment to democratic revolution, and fervently hoped the godly commonwealth they had established in the New World could also flourish in the Old.
Truly we are of one heart, I mean the body of the godly in New England, with the Parliament and army, and say that Christ hath carried them beyond men and themselves, in all that they have been driven to do.
By the 1650s, Sudbury was a success story, an autonomous, prosperous frontier town neatly organized within the precepts of godly Protestantism. Even the local indigenous people were starting to come into the fold. In 1649, the evangelist John Eliot reported that a number of Sudbury Indians were attending his preaching at the Massachusetts village of Nunantum in modern Newton, and after 1651, several praying Indians from the vicinity moved to Eliot's new mission town at Natick, which bordered Sudbury to the southeast. Among them were Tantamus, nicknamed Jethro, a neighbor of Cart who dwelt on Knobscot Hill on the west side of the river. His son, Anamatohu, who became a fiercely devoted Puritan, changed his name to Peter and made a career out of translating land deeds. Wutasakumponum, nicknamed Captain Tom, who in English accounts was depicted as both a grave and pious man and alternately an irascible alcoholic, who once drew gasps by using pages from the Bible as musket wadding, boasting that he would, quote, make the word of God fly. And Nettus, a Nipmuc warrior who had regular dealings with Sudbury settlers, not all of them productive. In 1659 he was sued by leading townsman John Parmenter for reneging on a debt, and by the 1670s had made a bitter enemy of a close English neighbour, the farmer Thomas Eames. With a foot in both cultural worlds, Praying Indians' devotion to their new religion varied wildly from individual to individual, but among the English, devout Puritanism was nearly universal and dictated almost every facet of their everyday life. Puritan dogma held its adherents to an impossibly high standard. As God's chosen people in the latter day, Puritan New Englanders were expected to comport themselves with the utmost virtue and diligence. Failing to do so would bring God's corrective wrath down upon the Commonwealth, as it often did upon the Israelites of the Hebrew Bible. But even the most committed Puritans struggled to reconcile the lofty goals of their ideology with the messy realities of human nature, particularly in regard to sex. Puritans rejected the traditional Christian belief that sex was a necessary evil serving the sole function of procreation. To the contrary, they celebrated sex as a joyous expression of love, as long as it remained within the bounds of heteronormative and religiously sanctified matrimony. In the 1622 Treatise of Domestical Duties, London clergyman William Gouge argued that regular sexual intimacy was a sure sign of a healthy marriage.
One of the best remedies that can be prescribed to married persons, next to an awful fear of God and a continual setting of Him before them, wheresoever they are, is that husband and wife mutually delight each in other, and maintain a pure and fervent love betwixt themselves, yielding that due benevolence one to another which is warranted and sanctified by God's word, and ordained of God for this particular end. This due benevolence, as the Apostle styleth it, is one of the most proper and essential acts of marriage.
However, any sex outside of these bounds was deeply problematic. Fornication between unmarried persons was against the law. Masturbation was considered odious. Sex between men was a capital crime. There's little doubt that such acts proliferated in towns like Sudbury, despite the laws and taboos. And in practice, the legal penalty for these transgressions was often significantly less severe than their biblical mandate. Later in the century, famous theologian Cotton Mather claimed that so many New Englanders were guilty of masturbation that a mountain would not provide enough rocks to stone them all. And despite the seriousness of the offense on paper, no one was ever actually executed for homosexuality in 17th century Massachusetts. The popular image of merciless, buckle-hatted patriarchs clapping star-crossed lovers in irons was more commonly found in Victorian literature than historical reality. But the fact remains that this was a deeply repressive, misogynistic, and homophobic society. And like all small towns, Sudbury had more than its fair share of dark secrets. Unsurprisingly, Massachusetts Puritans did not leave written evidence of their illegal and ungodly sexual dalliances. Even love letters are exceptionally rare. Most of what we know about the private life of Puritan Sudbury comes from court records and depositions recorded when crimes like fornication and adultery were prosecuted. Though constables, tithingmen, and other local law enforcement officials were thorough and efficient, it's highly likely that the vast majority of so-called offenses went undiscovered. Illicit sex and masturbation must have grown endemic in Sudbury during the 1650s as the second generation of colonists entered puberty and young adulthood. John Goodnow was still beating the meeting house drum the year Cromwell smashed the Scots, but he was no longer a sweet little boy. Now he was an adolescent roiling with hormones. So it was with many of the other children of the Confidence. Mary Haynes, 5 years old at the time of the crossing, was now nearly 20. She soon married another Confidence passenger, Peter Noyes' son, Thomas. The Bent family had come over with 4 sons aged 2 to 10 and 1 daughter aged 8. Now they were all in their teens or early 20s. Many of the families from Watertown also had children of a similar age. We have no reason to doubt these young people's religious dedication. Nonetheless, human biology and historical circumstance suggest with a high degree of certainty that at least some of them were involved in premarital sexual or romantic relationships. Not even God is a match for the teenage sex drive. We know from Middlesex County court records that most illicit sexual encounters in rural towns like Sudbury occurred between close neighbors or even members of the same household. Liaisons between adolescents and their parents' young servants or maids were common, as were marriages between them later in life. Outbuildings like barns and boathouses were ideal places for clandestine sex in the summer. And in winter, young lovers often snuck into each other's houses late at night when their parents were asleep. Militia training days, court days, and private meetings of church members drew adults and masters away from home for hours at a time, providing golden opportunities for whole afternoons of lovemaking in gloriously empty houses. But expressing love outside of heteronormative marriage came with considerable risk. The most typical way fornication came to light was when an unmarried woman's belly mysteriously began to swell, raising the inevitable hard questions. A similar case occurred in Sudbury in 1667, when Elizabeth Bent gave birth to a full-term baby 6 months after her marriage to Joseph Bent. Though Joseph initially asserted the child was his, he changed his story when faced with criminal prosecution. Matters were made even more complicated when Elizabeth announced the child's father was in fact one James Taylor, with whom she claimed to have had a long-time sexual relationship. Though she denied her affair with Taylor persisted after her wedding, this nonetheless placed her under suspicion of the much more serious crime of adultery. Eventually, Joseph admitted that Elizabeth had lied to protect him, offering this public confession before all his friends and neighbours in the meeting house.
Oi, Joseph Bent, do from the bottom of my heart acknowledge and confess that through the temptation of Satan and the provocation of my own lust, that I did fall into the sin of uncleanness before marriage with Elizabeth, my wife, and I have sadly fallen into another sin, of denying contrary to my conscience that the child born by my wife was not mine, and was well pleased that guilt was laid unto another, and some time of such a family whose honour and good name I should not have violated.
Fines and corporal punishment were the most common sentences for those found guilty of fornication, but other ramifications could be far more severe and lasting. The reputational damage was often permanent. Additionally, convicted fornicators could be forced to wed, trapping people in lifelong loveless marriages. In 1657, Edmund Goodnow's niece Mary was convicted of fornication with John Ross, a Scottish servant, and her main concern was not criminal punishment but rather the prospect of marrying Ross, which apparently horrified her. In 1665, the litigious John Parmenter sued one Christopher Bannister for impregnating his daughter, also named Mary, with an illegitimate child. Mary offered up a repentant public confession and Bannister was convicted, which probably did a great deal to unsully the Parmenter family name in Sudbury after the incident. John Goodnow, the pubescent boy who beat the meeting house drum, would grow into a sexually predatory old man plagued by scandal. In the 1690s, he monopolized many of the town offices, taking on the simultaneous roles of first selectman, militia captain, town clerk, and town meeting moderator. He was notorious for cheating at horse trading and scandalized his fellow selectmen with frequent public drunkenness. Worst of all, as a wealthy landlord, he used his economic power to pressure female tenants into sex. John rarely attended services at the meeting house, instead spending most Sundays philandering with Goody Brooks, a married woman. The complaints against John soon grew too numerous to ignore, and Selectman Joseph Noyes, a descendant of Peters, arraigned him on the charge of adultery. John settled the matter out of court, agreeing to resign all his public offices and pay an £8 fine. It was a relative slap on the wrist, though his reputation never recovered. But in the 1650s, that sordid story was still far in the future. The children of Sudbury were growing up, much like the town itself. The frontier village on the banks of the Musketaquid River was about to leave the carefree and harmonious days of its childhood behind, as generational and class divisions among the inhabitants deepened into unbridgeable gulfs, and an explosive local controversy threatened to tear Sudbury apart. Not idly did Edmund Goodnow declare,
"Be it right or wrong, we will have our way. If we can have it no other way, we will have it by club law."
Edmund Goodnow and Walter Haynes were from Wiltshire. Peter Noyes hailed from Hampshire. The villages where they were born were organised according to the manorial open field system of agriculture. The lord of the manor owned large tracts of what was known as common land, which a certain class of tenant farmers had the right to make collective use of. It was the only method of land administration they had ever known, and they established a similar system in Sudbury. The key difference being that in America, the only lord one had to answer to was God. But not everyone in town shared the same background. 15 years after its founding, Sudbury had inhabitants from just about every region in England, in particular the Puritan stronghold of East Anglia. In East Anglia, the system of commonage was far less prevalent, and farmers focused on managing their individual parcels of farmland in competition rather than cooperation with one another. For a time, the East Anglians abided by the open field policy of the town fathers, but now the pubescent town was rapidly changing. The next generation had come of age. The influx of new arrivals from England and other towns in the colony was growing year by year, and there wasn't enough land to go around. Edmund Goodnow had foreseen this eventuality in 1649 and petitioned the General Court for an additional 2-mile land grant for the town on Sudbury's western border. Nonetheless, the East Anglians and the younger farmers, many of whom were landless and as yet lacked the right to make use of the town's commons, referred to as meadow rights, began to openly question the fairness and efficiency of the old system. Why should so much good land, nearly 90% of all available land in Sudbury, be publicly rather than privately owned when there were so many vigorous young men without plots of their own? How could a young farmer expect to prosper and make a name for himself under such a system? Sudbury's land policy was skewed in favour of the town fathers, and meadow rights were still being determined by the ranked list the first Board of Selectmen had drawn up back in 1639. Reform was desperately needed if Sudbury was to adapt to its changing circumstances and shifting demographics. To the town fathers, this kind of talk seemed like a direct challenge, and they viewed it as nothing less than the undoing of their life's work. They had abandoned friends, family, lands, communities, and everything they had ever known in England, and taken the extraordinary risk of establishing a new town on the dangerous frontier of an unknown continent. They were not greedy men, hungry for personal power and aggrandizement, but they did demand respect for their age, their wisdom, their hard work, and their sacrifice. The town had been organized according to their vision, and an attack on the open field system was effectively an attack on their legacy. By now, Peter Noyes and Walter Haynes were hobbled and old, true village elders. Edmund Goodnow and Reverend Brown, once so fresh-faced and idealistic, were solidly middle-aged, established men with a lot to lose. Reverend Brown, in particular, had more than a spiritual stake in this issue. He was the largest meadow holder in Sudbury, with rights to about 300 acres. His 2-story house at Timber Neck was extremely well appointed, replete with an in-house kitchen, a parlour, and a study with a library of over 100 books. He had cows, pigs, horses, a servant, and a maid. Brown had always been a man of means, but as a beneficiary of the open field system, he had prospered enough to become the most affluent man in town. Any division of common land into private lots would inevitably come at his personal expense. Ironically, it was Brown who struck the first spark of the land controversy with the seemingly insignificant decision to transfer the meadow rights of 25 of his acres to one Thomas Walgrave, a wealthy gentleman of the peerage. Walgrave was the father-in-law of a Sudbury landowner, but crucially, he was not a resident of Sudbury himself. The small-time young farmers were outraged. Surely they had a better claim to land grants and meadow rights than rich out-of-towners. The town professed itself to be egalitarian and democratic, but Brown's move smacked of oligarchic nepotism. A handful of local men decided that something needed to be done. One of them, a hot-headed young reformer named John Ruddock, emerged as the face of the opposition, and their faction gained legitimacy with the enlistment of Selectman Edmund Rice to their cause. Rice was East Anglian, with 5 landless sons still dependent on him under the open field system, and had good reason to push reform. In the town meeting of October 1651, one of the reformers dropped a bombshell by formally proposing that the 2-mile westward grant be divided equally between every man in town. The town fathers were appalled by the motion, and alarmed by how much support it immediately garnered. Ruddock quickly realized the strength of his position. The East Anglian model was broadly popular in Sudbury, but the most politically active townsmen supported the open field system. So the reformers started a campaign to raise awareness. They talked to their neighbors, impressed upon them the importance of the issue, and encouraged them to come to meetings. Soon, town meetings became very crowded, prompting another divisive issue, replacing the old thatched roof meeting house with a larger and more dignified structure. The reformers, now a formidable voting bloc, enthusiastically supported raising funds for a new building. More room meant more votes, which could only be in their favor. The town fathers naturally opposed it. The wealthiest men in town paid the most taxes, and the majority of the construction expenses would come out of their own pockets. By December 1652, the reformers had enough momentum to bring the issue to a head, and the town voted in favor of a staggering £85 tax for the new meeting house. Adding insult to injury, the town had voted that the carpenters heading up construction could utilize a portion of Reverend Brown's meadow to gather hay, a measure that Ruddock quite possibly included as a personal slight to the out-of-touch minister. A little over a year later, in January 1654, a large crowd gathered in the roomy new meeting house to hear the selectmen propose a potential solution to the land controversy. The atmosphere was extremely tense. In the words of the attending clerk, there was, quote, much agitation among the townspeople that blistering winter morning. The selectmen called the meeting to order and laid out their compromise. The 1639 ranked list was to be nullified and a brand new division of land enacted, but land rights would still be tiered based on assessments of personal wealth and family size. The proposal, which had been designed to please everyone, pleased no one, and was soundly defeated. The reformers called another meeting the following day and put forth another motion, this one far simpler.
To every man an equal portion in quantity.
It passed with overwhelming support. This was a stinging defeat for the town fathers, but not a fatal one. They still had considerable political capital and held most of the seats on the Board of Selectmen. The reformers could have their private lots in the 2-mile grant, but if they disliked the open field system so much, then why should they enjoy its privileges? Goodnow, Haynes, and Noyes soon proposed legislation limiting the number of farm animals who could legally graze on common lands. Rifling back through years of records in the town book, Noyes pointed out to his fellow selectmen that they had passed an ordinance in 1643 stipulating that herd size on town commons would eventually need to be restricted. It was about time that that edict was put into effect. It was an obvious power play. The town fathers claimed that 8,000 acres of commonage could only support 775 animals, which was laughably untrue. Everyone knew that by restricting the size of herds on common lands, the town fathers were effectively putting a cap on the already meager agricultural output of the reformers' small private farms. The subsequent backlash was swift and extremely hostile. Ruddock publicly accused Noyes of putting his thumb on the scale, pushing the herd sizing legislation through without allowing sufficient debate. Reverend Brown threw the full weight of his ministry behind the town fathers, rushing into the fray of local politics with a ferociousness many members of his flock found unseemly. He even used the pulpit to further his secular interests, imploring during one Sunday service that the town consent to outside arbitration from a council of reverend elders, specifically the ministers of Watertown, Concord, and Cambridge, close friends of Brown's who would doubtlessly advise in his favor. Brown's boldly cynical overtures were met with offense and outrage, and many reformers stopped attending Sunday services, a drastic form of protest in such a devout culture. Ruddock's hatred for Brown deepened, going so far as to tell him in a town meeting that,
"Sitting aside your office, I regard you no more than another man."
The reformers insisted the herd sizing issue be put to an immediate vote. To make sure the count was accurate, a selectman, probably Peter Noyes, asked that those in favour of herd sizing move to one end of the meeting house, and those against gather together at the other end. The vote was split exactly down the middle, 27 for and 27 against. The two sides glared at each other from across the room. The issue was no closer to being resolved, and no one seemed willing to change their minds. By March 1656, town politics had become so dysfunctional and personal acrimony between the various players so corrosive that 6 out of the 7 selectmen lost their bids for re-election, including Noyes, Goodnow, and Haynes. John Ruddock replaced Noyes as first selectman. For almost a year, the reformers assumed leadership of the town, and the town fathers became the upstart opposition. The cat was chasing the dog. But the gridlock continued unabated. Brown's friends in the synod accused Ruddock of breaking the 5th and 9th commandments in his administration of the town, a rebuke that likely did not do wonders for his reputation. The General Court sent an investigatory committee to Sudbury, bizarrely concluded that the majority of the townspeople supported the herd sizing order and made a number of policy recommendations, which the town ignored. No administrative body in Massachusetts seemed capable of quelling the discord in Sudbury, least of all its own supposedly self-sufficient town government. At some point, Ruddock, Edmund Rice, and 11 other reformers became convinced that their lives in Sudbury were fractured beyond repair. After so many poisonous years of division and debate, how could Ruddock sit there and listen politely to one of Brown's sermons? How could Rice ever be colleagues with Noyes again, after all the caustic things each of them had said and done? Ruddock and Rice petitioned the General Court for permission to establish a new town to the west, and in September 1656, they led their families away from Sudbury and deep into the woods of Nipmuc country, where they broke ground on the newfound settlement of Marlborough. As a young man, Rice had left England to escape an unjust government. Now, as the elder statesman of the Sudbury reformers, he would bookend his life with yet another exodus to a new home. For John Howe, one of the other men who defected to found Marlborough, the decision to leave was an easy one. The luminaries of Sudbury had left them with no other choice.
"If you oppress the poor, they will cry out, and if you persecute us in one city, we must fly to another."
The town that had enjoyed such promising beginnings was now riven by greed, inequality, and personal animosity, and the collectivist ideal of Puritan politics was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the individualist philosophy of nascent American capitalism. Religious and political controversies were common in New England during this time, as the young colonies bickered and fought over what kind of society they wanted to be. Massachusetts was so preoccupied with infighting that it was completely oblivious to the dire threat arising in what was left of Dawnland. After years of brazen marginalization at the hands of English occupiers, the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett nations were about to take one last, dramatic, violent step to preserve their sovereignty and dignity. And the resulting bloodbath of King Philip's War would be the deadliest war per capita in American history. Find out how Sudbury became a battlefield next time on The Birth of an American Town.